Imagine walking deep into the silent Wyoming forest, carrying nothing but your pain, your memories, and the loyal dog who never leaves your side. That's exactly where Ethan, a battle-worn Marine, found himself, lost, exhausted, and searching for something he didn't even know he needed. But then, Ranger, his German shepherd, suddenly stopped. His ears lifted, his body stiffened, and right there, hidden behind the trees, they discovered a forgotten wooden cabin, untouched, abandoned, almost waiting for them. What Ethan found inside wasn't a mystery box, or treasure, or danger. It was something far more powerful, something that began to stitch back the pieces of a heart shattered by war. And you won't believe how this old cabin slowly became the one place where he finally felt safe again. Stay with me, because this story might remind you that healing can come from the most unexpected places, and maybe, just maybe, that God sends us exactly where we need to be. If you love stories about hope, faith, and second chances, please hit subscribe, leave a comment, and share this with someone who needs a little light today. Thank you for being here. Late autumn had settled over the outskirts of Jackson, Wyoming, casting long shadows across the quiet streets where the wind carried the chill of the coming winter. The small city, nestled between towering mountain ranges and endless forest, had always been known for its brutal seasonal shifts: dry winds slicing across open plains, sudden drops in temperature, and the kind of silence that felt almost too heavy for those unaccustomed to it. For Ethan Miller, however, this silence was preferable to the noise of his past. Ethan, a 38-year-old former Marine with a tall, broad-shouldered frame built from years of military training, carried the kind of ruggedness that came from both discipline and hardship. His face was sharply structured, marked by a defined jawline and light stubble that he rarely bothered to shave. His short, dark brown hair, peppered with early strands of gray, hinted at stress that had aged him faster than time should allow. His hazel eyes, normally warm, held a distant heaviness, the lingering echo of battles he could not forget. The trauma of losing close friends during deployment had reshaped him, turning his once easygoing personality into something quieter, more introspective, and often detached from crowds. The city reminded him too much of the chaos he wanted to leave behind. So on this crisp morning, he packed only essentials, slung his worn canvas backpack over his shoulder, and whistled for the one companion who had never left him. Ranger, his 5-year-old German shepherd, bounded out from the truck with steady, confident steps. The dog's large, muscular build and thick, sable-colored coat made him appear both noble and formidable. His ears were erect, his eyes sharp and intelligent, and his movements held the disciplined precision of a canine trained to accompany a soldier. Ranger had served with Ethan during some of the harshest years overseas, and though he bore a faint scar near his left hind leg, a thin, pale line that cut through the fur, it never diminished his strong stride. Loyal, protective, and attuned to Ethan's emotions, Ranger had become more than just a companion. He was a grounding presence, often guiding Ethan through moments when memories threatened to overwhelm him. Leaving the last wooden fences of Jackson behind, Ethan stepped into the trail that led toward the deeper forest. The cold air bit gently at his cheeks, and the ground beneath his boots was layered with golden leaves that crunched with each step. Above him, the sky was an expanse of pale gray, heavy with the promise of early snowfall, while the scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. Ethan breathed it in slowly, feeling a faint sense of calm begin to loosen the tension in his chest. He wasn't searching for anything specific, only space, silence, and perhaps a place where the nightmares that visited him at night would feel farther away. Ranger kept close at his side, occasionally moving ahead to scout the area, tail swaying in a relaxed rhythm. As they ventured farther from civilization, the forest thickened. The towering ponderosa pines and quaking aspens formed walls of amber and evergreen, muffling sound, letting only the soft whisper of wind pass through. Ethan found the solitude comforting. Every now and then, he reached down to brush his fingers against Ranger's back, grounding himself in the familiar warmth of the dog's presence. After several miles, the scenery shifted subtly. The forest floor sloped downward, the air growing cooler as the path narrowed and became less traveled. Ranger's ears perked, head lifting sharply as his nose twitched. Ethan paused. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured, his voice low but steady. Ranger stepped forward, tail stiffening, and began to follow something unseen, sniffing along the ground with growing interest. Ethan trusted Ranger's instincts implicitly. He followed without hesitation, stepping over fallen logs and brushing past low branches as Ranger guided him off the main trail. The unofficial path they were now treading felt forgotten, less a trail and more a faint memory of one. Grass and weeds had grown tall across it, and the soil beneath showed no sign of recent human presence. Despite this, Ranger moved with purpose, his strides sure and unwavering. The deeper they walked, the more isolated the forest felt, as though they were entering a pocket of untouched wilderness. The wind quieted, birdsong faded, and the hush of nature settled heavily around them. Ethan sensed something ahead before he saw it, an odd shift in the air, a faint stillness that didn't quite match the forest's natural rhythm. Then, within a small clearing hidden between clusters of dense pine, he saw it. A small wooden cabin stood there, weathered by time, partially swallowed by the surrounding nature. Moss crawled up the sides, the once strong beams now softened by age. Ropes of rattan-thick vines hung over the roof, and the porch sagged slightly, as though tired from years of holding itself upright. The windows were opaque with dust and grime, reflecting only muted light. Shutters hung askew, creaking faintly when the breeze brushed past them. Ethan approached cautiously, taking in every detail. The cabin looked abandoned, yet there was something strangely inviting about its solitude, something that echoed the emptiness inside him. Ranger sniffed around the porch, tail low but not tense, examining the old wood with curiosity rather than alarm. Ethan stepped onto the creaking planks of the porch, placing a steadying hand on the worn railing. The forest behind him felt far away, softened by the quiet that surrounded the cabin. He exhaled slowly, a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. For the first time in a long while, he sensed the possibility of peace. Not a cure, not a sudden fix, but a place where healing could begin. And as he stood there, with Ranger at his feet and the forgotten cabin before him, he felt something simple yet profound. He was exactly where he needed to be. Ethan pushed the creaking door open, letting a sliver of pale daylight spill into the dim interior of the cabin. The air inside was cold and smelled faintly of damp wood, dust, and long abandonment. He paused for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust before stepping fully across the threshold. The floorboards groaned under his weight, yet nothing else stirred. No movement, no presence, only stillness. It immediately struck him how intact the place was, despite clearly being unused for years. A wooden table stood to the left, its surface coated in a thick layer of dust, but still sturdy. A chair lay toppled nearby as if someone once sat there and rose abruptly and never returned. Old utensils sat forgotten in a drawer left half open, metal dulled by time. There were no photographs, no letters, no journals, nothing that could tell Ethan who once lived here. The emptiness felt deliberate, like a story erased but not fully gone. Ranger trotted inside, his nails tapping lightly against the wood. He sniffed the corners of the room with focused curiosity. The dog's thick sable coat glimmered in the muted light, emphasizing the strength in his posture as he examined the surroundings. Eventually, he settled in front of an old stone fireplace. Although the hearth was filled only with ashes long turned gray, Ranger lay down with his front legs stretched out and his head lifted, watching Ethan with steady, calm eyes, as if waiting for him to make sense of this place. Ethan brushed his hand across the dusty edge of the table, leaving a clean streak behind. The dust clung to his skin, reminding him of sandstorms he had endured overseas, moments when visibility dropped to nothing and the world felt far away. The silence inside the cabin pressed against him, heavy like the quiet that fell after a firefight, when he would count the remaining breaths of his team. Those memories crept in uninvited, tightening his throat. He inhaled deeply and exhaled slower, grounding himself in the present. He set his backpack down and rolled up his sleeves. "All right," he murmured to himself, not expecting an answer. "Let's tidy this place a bit." Cleaning was not something he normally enjoyed, but here it felt purposeful, almost necessary. He found an old broom leaning against the wall, its handle smooth with age but still functional, and began sweeping the floor. Dust rose in swirling clouds, drifting through the beams of pale light filtering in. Each stroke of the broom reminded him of the hours he once spent assembling camps with fellow Marines, their laughter mixing with the clinking of tools and the rhythmic patting of tent fabric. Those were simpler moments tucked between chaos, small pockets of normalcy that made harsh days bearable. Ranger shifted as the dust stirred, shaking himself once before resting his chin on his paws. Ethan smiled faintly at the dog's expression, which conveyed mild disapproval yet patience. Working methodically, he swept the dust into a corner, then cleared cobwebs from the walls and the ceiling. He tested the chairs, tightened loose joints in the wooden frames, and wiped grime from the windows until the forest outside appeared faintly through the glass. It was slow work, but as Ethan moved through the cabin, he felt layers of internal tension easing. He found odd comfort in repairing things with his hands. During the service, building or fixing shelters had given him control when life felt uncontrollable. Here, too, repairing the cabin felt symbolic, mending something forgotten, mirroring the healing he sought within himself. The cabin did not resist him. It welcomed the effort in quiet acceptance. After some time, Ethan approached the fireplace where Ranger rested. The stones surrounding the hearth were cracked in places, but they were strong. He imagined fires that once warmed this room, casting dancing shadows across the walls. He knelt and touched the old ash, rubbing the cool grains between his fingers. "Someone lived here," he whispered, though no one needed to hear it. The absence of personal belongings only sharpened the mystery, but instead of unsettling him, it amplified the cabin's lonely peace, a peace he felt drawn to. Ranger raised his head, studying Ethan's face with his deep brown eyes. The dog's loyalty was unwavering. Whenever Ethan's thoughts began to drift toward darker memories, Ranger's presence gently anchored him. Ethan reached out and ran his fingers through the dog's thick fur, feeling warmth seep into his cold hands. He stood, stretched his back, and surveyed the room he had gradually restored to some semblance of order. It wasn't perfect. The place was still old, neglected, and rough around the edges. Yet it felt different now, lighter, calmer, as though the act of cleaning had stirred the air and awakened something peaceful within the walls. There was no journal waiting to reveal secrets, no hidden story offering closure. There was only silence, the smell of ancient wood, and the feeling of being alone but not lonely. Ethan realized that in its emptiness, the cabin mirrored him. It held memories, yet withheld them, waiting quietly for someone to breathe life back into it. As dusk approached, Ethan lit his lantern and watched the warm glow reach into the corners of the room. Ranger curled beside him, content. The cabin was no longer just a forgotten structure in the woods. It was becoming part of his healing. And as the night settled around them, with the forest quiet and the cabin finally breathing again, Ethan knew he was beginning to face himself, just as the story had begun. Night settled over the forest, with a heaviness that felt almost sentient, wrapping itself around the cabin as temperatures dropped sharply. The air outside had turned brittle, and each gust of wind carried a cutting chill that scraped across the wooden walls. Inside, Ethan knelt near the stone fireplace he had cleaned earlier, arranging dry branches and splinters of fallen bark he had gathered before dusk. His hands moved with practiced ease, the instinctive motions of someone who had built countless fires during long nights in the field. When the flame finally sparked to life, it cast a warm amber glow across the small room, pushing back the shadows that clung to the corners. The flickering light fell over Ethan's face, softening the sharp angles of his jaw and illuminating the faint lines etched into his forehead. These were lines carved not by age alone, but by exhaustion, grief, and years of bracing himself against storms, both physical and emotional. Ranger settled close to him, the dog's thick coat rising and falling with steady breaths. He positioned himself so that his flank brushed lightly against Ethan's leg, close enough to reassure, but not imposing. The subtle warmth radiating from Ranger's body felt grounding, a reminder that Ethan was not alone even when silence pressed in around him. Outside, the wind gathered strength. It howled through the tight cracks between the logs, slipping into the room as thin, icy drafts. The cabin creaked in response, groaning under the pressure of the cold night. Ethan lifted his gaze toward the nearest window. The glass trembled faintly, shimmering with reflections of firelight. The glow shimmered, then bent, as if distorted by memories he had spent years trying to bury. And then the wind carried a sound, a high, sharp whistle as it forced itself through the narrow gaps in the doorframe. The sound pierced the quiet, and Ethan stiffened. His breath hitched. For a second, the whistle became something else entirely. The scream of incoming mortar rounds, the cutting wail of alarms, the warning calls of soldiers scrambling for cover. He squeezed his eyes shut, but that only made the memory sharper. He could hear the thudding blasts, feel the ground shudder beneath him, smell the burning metal and scorched earth. He heard voices, familiar, strained, panicked, calling out across the chaos. Men he trained with, men he fought beside, men who never returned home. His chest tightened as though an invisible band constricted around it. His breathing grew shallow, each inhale clipped and jagged. His hands trembled slightly, and the room seemed to narrow around him, the walls inching closer with the weight of old trauma pressing inward. Ranger lifted his head immediately. The dog's ears perked, and he shifted his body, rising onto his front legs with a low, concerned whine. With a gentle movement, Ranger closed the small distance between them and placed his head on Ethan's thigh. His warm muzzle pressed softly into the fabric of Ethan's worn jeans. Ethan's eyes opened slowly. At first, the firelight blurred with the remnants of his memories, but then the clarity returned. The wind was only wind. The The cabin was still intact. Ranger was here, steady, calm, unwavering. Ethan let out a shaky breath and lowered his hand onto the top of Ranger's head. His fingers sank into the thick fur, feeling each strand beneath his touch. Ranger's presence anchored him, pulling him back into the present, reminding him that the battlefields existed only in his mind now. "You're all right," Ethan whispered, not to Ranger, but to himself, though the dog understood the sentiment in his tone. Ranger pushed his head more firmly against Ethan's thigh, a silent affirmation that he was staying right there. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with a steady rhythm that soothed his nerves. Ethan shifted slightly, leaning his back against the wooden wall as he focused on the warmth from the fire and the solid weight of Ranger resting against him. Slowly, his breathing evened out as the tension in his chest eased. He looked around the room again, taking in the worn furniture he had cleaned earlier, the dust-free shelves, the softened glow of the lantern set on the table. The cabin, despite its age, its creaks, its flaws, felt protective, almost like a shelter built for healing rather than mere survival. It wrapped him in a quiet that didn't feel threatening but instead felt necessary. Years had passed since Ethan last felt truly safe. Even after returning home, he never found a place where his mind could rest. Cities were too loud, crowds too tense. Even his own house carried ghosts in every shadow. But here, in this forgotten wooden refuge deep in the Wyoming forest, he sensed something different. The cabin did not demand anything of him. It did not trigger memories with familiar scents or clamor with reminders of the past. Instead, it offered space. Space to breathe, space to grieve, space to simply exist. Ranger adjusted his position, curling closer to Ethan as if to shield him from the night. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of Ranger's breathing. As the flames continued their gentle dance, Ethan realized something with quiet certainty. This place, unexpected and hidden, was the first space since leaving the Marines where he truly felt safe. Ranger's steadfast presence only strengthened that truth, and in the dim fire-lit room, surrounded by the hush of the night wind, Ethan felt the smallest spark of peace begin to return, fragile but real. Morning arrived gently, slipping through the dusty cabin windows as soft beams of pale gold. The forest outside glistened beneath a thin layer of frost, each leaf and fallen branch shimmering faintly in the cold light. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, feeling the crisp air press against his skin. The night had been quiet, and for the first time in a long while, he had slept deeply, without the sudden jolts of panic that usually dragged him awake. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the chilled morning air, letting it settle into his lungs like something cleansing. Ranger padded out beside him, stretching his strong body before shaking his coat, sending tiny droplets of dew scattering. The dog's bright, alert eyes scanned the clearing as he wagged his tail, clearly energized by the new day. Ethan glanced down at him with a faint smile. "Ready to get to work?" he asked softly. Ranger responded with a happy bark and bounded off the porch, circling the yard with youthful enthusiasm. The cabin looked different in daylight. It appeared worn, weather-beaten, and undeniably old, but it no longer felt abandoned. Instead, it looked like a project waiting for someone to believe in it again. Ethan rolled up his sleeves, walked to the edge of the porch, and began inspecting the sagging roof. When he pressed lightly against one of the wooden beams, it creaked ominously. He shook his head. "We'll fix you up," he murmured. Piece by piece. He gathered fallen branches, old planks, and whatever usable material he could find around the clearing. The repairs were simple but meaningful, replacing loose shingles with salvaged wood, tightening the porch railings, brushing away layers of debris that had accumulated through seasons of neglect. As he worked, Ethan felt a sense of purpose humming beneath his ribs, a steady rhythm that soothed him more than he expected. His hands, once trained for survival and combat, were now smoothing splintered wood and aligning crooked boards. Every action felt like a quiet declaration that he was not broken beyond repair. Ranger supervised with pride, occasionally trotting over with sticks in his mouth, as if offering contributions to the work. His posture remained alert and strong, his thick sable coat catching the sunlight in warm tones. He barked now and then as he darted around the yard, his joy infectious. Ethan turned his attention to the windows next. He removed the cracked glass panes, replacing them with sturdier ones he had found stacked in a forgotten shed behind the cabin. The shed itself was small, old, and overgrown with ivy, but the tools inside, rusted but functional, made him feel as though someone long ago had hoped this place would be preserved. With each pane set in place, more light poured into the cabin, spilling across the floorboards and banishing shadows that had lingered far too long. It felt symbolic, a quiet reminder that even the darkest spaces could be brightened with patience and work. Next, he moved to the backyard. The area was wild and tangled, filled with fallen branches, tall grass, and patches of stubborn weeds. Ethan grabbed an old rake and began clearing the space. Ranger bounded happily through the scattered leaves, kicking up bursts of color as he darted between the trees. Watching the dog race around freely brought a warmth to Ethan's chest. Ranger had endured trauma too. Combat deployments, loud explosions, chaotic environments. But somehow, he had emerged with resilience and unwavering loyalty. Ethan admired that. Maybe he could learn from it. The more he worked, the quieter his mind became. The memories that usually stalked him, images of fire, smoke, and loss, felt more distant beneath the steady rhythm of his repairs. He found himself humming softly under his breath, a habit he'd long forgotten. The forest air filled his lungs with something crisp and healing. By midday, he stepped back to survey his progress. The cabin still wasn't perfect, not even close, but it looked cared for. It looked lived in. The porch no longer sagged dangerously. The windows gleamed with new clarity. The yard looked less like a forgotten patch of wilderness and more like a space meant for peace. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow and felt a rare sensation. Quiet satisfaction. Ranger approached him, nudging his leg with his muzzle, tail sweeping happily behind him. Ethan crouched and wrapped an arm around the dog's strong shoulders. "We're doing all right," he whispered. "Aren't we?" Ranger responded with a gentle, approving huff. As evening approached, Ethan returned inside the cabin. The space welcomed him with warmth and newfound light. He lit a small fire, watched the flames catch, and felt a calmness seep into his bones. When he lay down to rest, Ranger curled beside him, the dog's steady breathing a comforting anchor. For once, sleep came easily, and unlike so many nights before, it stayed gentle, undisturbed by shadows of the past. Here, surrounded by nature's stillness and Ranger's unwavering companionship, Ethan finally felt the fractures inside him begin to knit back together. The days that followed unfolded with a gentle rhythm Ethan hadn't experienced in years. Each morning greeted him with soft light filtering through the newly cleaned windows, touching the wooden floor with warm hues that made the cabin feel less like a relic and more like a sanctuary awakening from a long slumber. The forest, once foreign and intimidating, now seemed to breathe in harmony with him. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call blended into a quiet soundtrack that soothed parts of him he had long ignored. Ethan spent the mornings walking the perimeter of the clearing with Ranger trotting proudly at his side. The dog's strong frame moved with renewed energy, his thick sable coat rippling as he bounded through the underbrush. Ranger appeared happier here than anywhere else they had been since returning home. The open space, the crisp air, and the sense of belonging matched perfectly with his loyal, grounded nature. Watching him dart in and out of the trees, Ethan often felt his own spirit being lifted, as if Ranger was pulling him forward into a life that no longer revolved around the past. Inside the cabin, the changes were subtle but transformative. Ethan had arranged the small furniture he repaired into a cozy corner near the fireplace. The once dusty shelves now held a few practical items he unpacked from his backpack. His canteen, a folded map, a pocket knife given to him by a fallen friend, and a tin mug he carried through every deployment. These small objects, once symbols of survival, now felt like reminders that he had lived through something difficult and come out the other side. During midday, he would sit at the newly cleaned table, lit by sunlight pouring through the replaced window panes. He often found himself lost in thought, tracing the grain of the wood with his fingertips, letting memories surface and fade without their usual sting. The cabin seemed to absorb them, as if offering a quiet promise. You're safe here. You can let go. One evening, after spending hours clearing the last patch of the yard, Ethan walked to the porch and sat on the newly reinforced steps. The wood felt solid beneath him, sturdy in a way that mirrored the growing steadiness inside his chest. Ranger followed and settled down beside him, the dog lying with his front paws crossed, posture relaxed, eyes half closed as if savoring the peaceful air. Before them, the forest glowed under the late autumn sunset. The sky blazed with shades of amber, rose, and fading gold as the sun dipped behind the distant ridges. The trees caught the light and shimmered like fields of copper. A soft breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of pine and fallen leaves. Ethan watched the scene with quiet awe. For years, sunsets had been a reminder of nightfall, when memories grew darker, when sleep became a battle, when silence felt dangerous. But now, as the light slowly faded over the forest, he felt only calm. The tension in his shoulders eased, his breath settled into a slow, steady rhythm. Ranger lifted his head, brushing it gently against Ethan's arm. Ethan reached down, resting a hand on the dog's strong back. The warmth beneath his palm felt symbolic, steady, loyal, grounding. "We did good, didn't we?" Ethan whispered. Ranger's tail thumped softly in response. The cabin behind them glowed with the golden remnants of daylight. Each repair Ethan made during the past days, every tightened beam, every cleared log, every window washed free of grime, had stitched a bit of peace back into his soul. It wasn't that the pain was gone. Pain never disappeared that easily. But here, in this forgotten place deep in the Wyoming woods, the pain felt manageable. It felt like something he could sit with without drowning. He looked again toward the horizon, watching the sun sink fully behind the mountains. The colors dimmed into cool shades of purple and blue. Ranger yawned, resting his head on Ethan's boot as twilight settled into the clearing. Ethan exhaled, the breath leaving him in a quiet, contented sigh. For the first time since he had returned from service, he felt anchored. Not to a city, not to a routine, but to a feeling, a sense of belonging, a sense that he didn't have to keep running from the shadows inside his own mind. "This isn't my house," Ethan murmured, eyes still fixed on the fading sky. "But it feels like home." The words were soft, but true in a way that felt almost startling. He paused, then added, "We'll come back. Every fall. This will be our place." Ranger responded with a gentle bark, a quiet, affirming sound that made Ethan smile. The dog shifted closer until their shoulders touched. As night fully descended and the forest hummed with the soft music of crickets, Ethan sat with Ranger beside him, the cabin behind them, and the vast sky stretching overhead. They didn't speak. One couldn't, the other didn't need to. Solitude wasn't loneliness anymore. It was peace. And so the story closed with two soldiers, one man, one dog, finding a home they never meant to discover, but one they both needed more than they realized. Sometimes in life, healing doesn't come from the places we expect. It doesn't arrive with noise, glory, or grand miracles. Sometimes God's miracles are quiet, found in a forgotten cabin in the woods, in the wag of a loyal dog's tail, or in the whisper of the wind reminding us that we're still here, still breathing, still capable of rebuilding what was broken inside us. For Ethan, peace didn't come from medicine, from people, or from running away. It came from slowing down long enough to hear the gentle voice that God places inside every soul, the voice that says, "You are not alone. I am with you." And just like Ethan, we all have days when life feels heavy, when memories hurt, and when we wonder if our hearts will ever find a home again. But healing can begin in the simplest moments: a sunset, a quiet prayer, a small act of kindness, or the unconditional love of a loyal companion. If you are watching this today, may God bless you with comfort, courage, and peace. May He guide your steps, heal the hidden pains of your heart, and remind you that no matter how lost you feel, you are never forgotten. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others may feel the same warmth. Leave a comment to tell us what part inspired you the most, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, healing, and hope. May God's grace be with you and your loved ones, today and always. Amen.